I think I was interested in Lincoln and the Civil War from almost as long as I can remember. I was introduced to the subject, especially the subject of Lincoln, through a Classics Illustrated comic book when I was 6 or 7 or 8, something like that. And the subject stayed with me all through my youth, and even when I wasn't concentrating professionally on the Civil War and Lincoln, still off to the side. I was doing things that were connected to, maybe distantly connected to, but still connected to, Civil War and Lincoln. I think there is a kind of democracy, a spiritual democracy, that you participate in as a history person. In that democracy, when we usually think about it politically, is supposed to include everyone in our community who is alive now. History allows you to expand that democracy to include those who aren't with us anymore, but whose voices still need to be heard. History, when it's done rightly, is a kind of democracy of the dead because it expands the boundaries and the horizons of our community so that we have with us always a living memory of who we are and what we have been. Memory like that is what gives people, I believe, strength, courage, resolution. The great Russian dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, once said that the most direct way to enslave a people was to deprive them of their memory, to wipe it out, because then they had nothing else to compare the present to. I came at Lincoln from an oblique angle, let's say, in that I didn't do my graduate work and didn't really think that I was going to specialize in doing Abraham Lincoln. In fact, what I really devoted a good deal of my own training to was the history of American ideas. It was ideas that fascinated me, and especially the ideas that Americans lived with and worked with, let's say from about the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, including the Civil War. That was the era I really found fascinating, and I worked on figures as different from each other as Whig philosophers and religious revivalists. It was in the course of working on one of those projects in 1994 to 95, when I was a fellow at the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University, that I decided that there was an opportunity in one of these projects to include some material on Lincoln. It was a project about the idea of free will and determinism in American philosophy. And I recollected from all the things I'd read about Lincoln in past years that he had had a few thoughts and a few things to say on the subject, and I thought it would be, well, at least very clever to include Abraham Lincoln in a book that was otherwise devoted to philosophers. But the more that I worked on Lincoln's contribution to this one question, the more Lincoln, so to speak, took over. And one thing that struck me was how little had been devoted in this enormous body of literature on Lincoln to Lincoln as a man of ideas. There was plenty of stuff on Lincoln as a politician, as a war president, Lincoln and religion, Lincoln and family life, Lincoln and temperance, Lincoln and spelling form, Lincoln and almost everything, fill in the blank. But one thing that just seemed to be remarkably absent was this business of Lincoln as a man of ideas. And yet, while Lincoln, we would not call him in any strict professional sense, an intellectual. He was not a book person as a living. He was a lawyer. He was a basic general practice lawyer, not a legal philosopher. Nevertheless, he was a man of remarkable intellectual gifts, with a very sharp and tingling intellectual curiosity that constantly took him out of the mere professional channels of reading into a wide variety of subjects: geology, philology, religion, philosophy. Again, not as a professional, but simply as a man with an unbounded curiosity and the intellect capable of supporting it. Discovering that in the Lincoln literature there was so little on this, I suppose I grabbed the baton and ran with it. And so came the first book that I wrote on Lincoln, which was Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, an intellectual biography of Lincoln on Lincoln as a man of ideas. And that, you might say, is what opened up the box. Because it turned out from that point that in this enormous Lincoln literature, what you had was a field which had been plowed up only in very narrow furrows. If you think of that field, you can see very deep ruts, subjects, the same subjects, worked over and over again by people. But in between those ruts, vast amounts of territory that had never been plowed up at all. And I decided this might be a very interesting thing to do. One of the things that stood out right away in my mind was the lack of literature on the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this was a document that Lincoln thought was the greatest act of his administration. He said so. And yet, for all the books that have been written about Lincoln's second inaugural, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, correspondingly, there was almost nothing that had been written about the Emancipation Proclamation. And in fact, a good deal of the few things that had been written about the Emancipation Proclamation were devoted to questioning it, sometimes even trashing it. In the initial stage, I really do little more than soak myself in the sources. Sometimes it's reading all the secondary literature, and at this point, when I read the secondary literature, I'm reading not just what people have written, but I'm also poring through their footnotes. I'm looking for where they have quarried material from. Then, as things begin to come clearer, specific questions begin to come to mind. Specific problems begin to emerge. Specific personalities begin to become important. I start looking for where their collections of papers are, what books they may have published, memoirs. I read through those. I can obtain things on microfilm by interlibrary loan. We have a wonderful interlibrary loan system here through Gettysburg College. And then I read newspapers, especially if you're doing political material during the years of the Civil War and the decades before it. The newspapers are one of the great treasure troves of information. And what's more, the newspapers are interesting in their own right because the newspapers inadvertently tell you what people thought was important. Sometimes these newspapers are trying to create importance, but they couldn't be entirely creative on their own because they had to sell themselves. So they also had to publish material that they realized would satisfy the cravings of the people for what they thought was important. So taken together, I'm getting a sense of what was important to people then. Finally, I get to my last stage, which is when I become the prisoner, you might say, of 4x6 cards. Oh, how I love 4x6 cards, because it's on 4x6 cards that I code information, record source material, and literally I acquire boxes of 4x6 cards as I'm accumulating research data. And when I've finally arrived at about, let's say, 3 fairly good-sized 4x6 card file boxes, I know that I'm about ready to go. That's not an absolute, but it's usually pretty close. At that point, that's when I become the Mississippi Riverboat Gambler. Because I take all these 4x6 cards, and then I must sort them. I'll work up a short outline, maybe a 1-page outline with major topics on it, and I'll number them, and then I'll go through my boxes of 4x6 cards and put the appropriate numbers to them, and there I am dealing out the cards like the Mississippi Riverboat Gambler. Piles of cards according to chapters or topic. I take the cards, I sit down, and I start to write. The doors were finally closed at 2 o'clock, and Lincoln went back upstairs. Sometime that afternoon, the 2 Sewards reappeared with a corrected version of the proclamation and the handwritten draft Lincoln had finished earlier that day. By that time, Lincoln was thoroughly exhausted. I was tired that day, he admitted later to New Jersey Congressman James Scoville, but his determination to finish this work was as high as heaven. With the engrossed copy spread out before him, Lincoln picked up a pen he had already promised to Charles Sumner as a keepsake, and after dipping it in his inkwell, moved to sign it. His hand and forearm were trembling, and he put down the pen. After a moment, he tried again, and again the shaking in his enormous, bony hand made him set the pen on the desk. I could not for a moment control my arm, Lincoln later told his loyal congressional ally, Isaac Arnold. I paused, and a superstitious feeling came over me which made me hesitate. Was all this a mistake? Was the trembling a sign? Yet another divine warning, this time that he had gone too far, had overreached himself, had taken a step which would end only in disaster? Then he remembered that I had been shaking hands for hours with several hundred people. As much to assure himself as the Sewards, Lincoln declared that I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. The tremor in his hand was not because of doubt or hesitation over the proclamation, but merely because I have been receiving calls and shaking hands till my arm is stiff and numb. But if that explained the meaning of the tremors to his own satisfaction, it might not convince others if the shakiness caused his signature on the proclamation to waver. They will say he had some compunctions. But then the iron, again, came back into him. Anyway, it is going to be done. And he signed, slowly and carefully, slightly cramping the final M in his first name and the loop of the L at the beginning of Lincoln. There it was, as clear as it needed to be. Abraham Lincoln. He stood up with a smile, and a laugh followed at his apprehension, and he remarked quietly, "That will do."